Hi everyone. This week we spoke to Dr Robin Carhart-Harris from Imperial College's Centre for Psychedelic Research. Robin and his team focus on the clinical use of psychedelics, in particular looking at their potential in treating depression. Robin was an absolutely fascinating guest, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hi Robin, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah.
So to start with, we always ask what your kind of relationship to mental health is, and how you got into the area that you're in at the moment.
Yeah, that's a good question. Nice open question. Well, gosh. In terms of family, I wouldn't say anyone in my immediate family have had any obvious psychiatric disorders. Well, now I think. Personally, I think as a young man, I had anxiety issues. And I probably experienced, a few depressive episodes or something like them. Never had any sort of formal treatment beyond taking myself to have psychotherapy when I was a young man. And then, of course, professionally, I've been, gravitationally pulled into mental health through just a keen interest in the topic. And it was partly through a maybe more fundamental interest in the mind and the brain. And then, I guess what's called abnormal psychology, mental health, mental illness is just a fascinating part of that, greater fundamental. So, yeah, just pulled in through intrigue, I suppose, and some personal experience with mental illness. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the field that you're in at the moment, what first attracted you to the use of psychedelics for their potential for treating mental health issues? Was there a kind of a side route into it, or were you always interested in looking at that area in specific?
Yeah, it was a side route. It was more that I was interested in them for their more general revelatory properties. My introduction, beyond some personal experience, my academic introduction was finding Stan Grof's book Realms of the Human Unconscious while studying psychoanalysis, and this just made it all feel sort of, funnily enough, it made it all feel tangible. A space psychoanalysis that's sort of, deeply abstract and at times more sort of art form than science. And but here was a concrete tool, a drug. That book is all about LSD, Realms of the Human Unconscious. And I thought, well, this is the route in a sense, to bring, empirical methods to psychoanalysis. So it was kind of, that was the big turning point, was finding Stan Grof's book.
Yeah, and I think something that maybe a lot of people don't realise is that actually, I think it was, I can't remember the exact time frame, but I think it was during the 50s and maybe the 60s that this was quite a well-researched area that I can't remember, I'm not sure how kind of empirically strong and how valid the results were from it, but this was an area that was under kind of investigation for the use in kind of, I think it was alcoholism and OCD and things like that, and then it kind of went underground. Can you talk a little bit about why that happened and where the revival in the interest in it came from?
Yeah, sure. So the 1950s and 1950 itself is when the first English language scientific paper on LSD is published. LSD is discovered by Albert Hofmann in 1943, but it takes 7 years before America, I suppose, turn on to to LSD, and then this paper Bush and Johnson 1950 is, to my knowledge, the first scientific paper on LSD and its effects on the mind. And so throughout the 50s, there is this wave of a very academic and clinical psychiatric interest in LSD and a bit of mescaline. And then as we come into the around 1957, we have magic mushrooms being researched. Again, Albert Hofmann is the first to isolate psilocybin from these mushrooms, and then actually synthesize it, and he calls the compound psilocybin. And then there's a famous article in Life magazine about this amateur mycologist who goes into Mexico and has a magic mushroom ceremony with this curandera, Maria Sabina. And so the 50s is academic. It's very professional and lab coats and very formal in a sense, the way you think of the 50s or I do. And then in the 60s, things get a little more playful, and you have these kind of where you have a few clownish characters like Timothy Leary's the most famous, actually a Harvard psychology professor who turns on first to magic mushrooms and then LSD. And he kind of goes awry in a way, because he becomes this populist figure, popularizing figure, sort of promoting quite free use. And he's speaking at what do they call it? The Human Being in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, I think it is. And, to I don't know how many people, but, big crowds. And he says, turn on, tune in and drop out. And so anyway, the culture starts shifting into this sort of LSD promotional thing. And it gets caught up in the politics of the time, where you have, on the one hand, the countercultural movement, anti-war, anti-Vietnam war and pro-civil rights. And then on the other hand, you have the deep, heavy, powerful establishment, and they win is the short story. And LSD, that was entirely legal until the mid to late 1960s, becomes controlled. And the unfortunate thing is that controlling of the drug and its use and supply has a massive impact on the research. And I don't know why it happened that way, but the research was essentially banned and died as sort of I was going to say slow. It was quite a quick death. From the 1970s, you have the Misuse of Drugs Act coming in 1970 under what's his name, the famous American politician, President Nixon, and then it's a UN policy that the UK and other countries sign up to, and so basically that kills psychedelic research for decades, and it's only sort of into the mid 90s and then the noughties that we start to see what now we refer to, or most people have been referring to, as the psychedelic renaissance.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, the kind of the perception of these substances in my generation is that they're kind of rightly or wrongly associated with kind of hippies and that kind of thing, when even someone like me, who's pretty engaged in mental health and the mental health literature, until last year I had no real idea about the fairly solid scientific background that they had in the kind of research community. So how much, I suppose, damage, I don't know if damage is the right word, but how much damage did that kind of association with the counterculture and perhaps figures like Timothy Leary do to the kind of scientific efficacy of using the drugs to treat, I think specifically addictions, which had fairly good scientific backing from the 50s. How much damage did that do you think?
Yeah, well, it certainly tripped up progress, and opinions differ on where to place the blame. And the likes of Timothy Leary have been arguably scapegoated and sort of blamed for the collapse of psychedelic science. I don't know. It is what it is, and it happened how it happened. And I think the greater blame, if we're going to play the blame game, is on the deep establishment that stopped the research. That shouldn't have happened. And there is this cultural baggage that psychedelics still carry, where you hear psychedelic and you think of psychedelic art and colors and fractal patterns and psychedelic music and the Beatles and all their colorful attire. And so there's that baggage. Is that that in and of itself isn't damaging. It sort of trivializes the topic. I think people think of that before they realize that psychedelic means psyche revealing. And then, oh my goodness, how interesting.
So let's talk about the work that you've been doing recently and the results that that's garnered. And I think one of the important things that you did was compare the use of psych. You can talk about how it was administered and things like that, but the importance of comparing it to I can't remember which specific antidepressant it was, but comparing it to an antidepressant and why that's important.
Yeah, so we recently completed this trial and had it published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And the comparison, so there's two conditions, psilocybin therapy, and people have 2 sessions with that, and they get quite a big dose, 25 milligrams. And then the other condition, so 2 groups, as I said, and it's a random allocation to the group, and that's all done in this blinded way, so people don't know what they're going to get, and the people running the study, don't know what condition someone's going into. So you call that a double-blind randomized control trial. And the comparator condition is escitalopram. So it's a very selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI. And the most famous one is Prozac, fluoxetine. Another famous one is citalopram. And escitalopram is a kind of turbo version of citalopram. And it's what considered one of the best performing SSRIs. Meta-analyses have shown it has pretty good efficacy and tolerability relative to other SSRI antidepressants. So that was the head-to-head, and people get 6 weeks of daily escitalopram if they go into that condition. We standardize everything and control for everything. So all the psychological support that you get in the psilocybin condition, you also get in the escitalopram condition, so that people couldn't see the results and say, it was the psychotherapy that got people better in the psilocybin arm. So we've done that trial, and the results were really interesting. They quite emphatically, although you wouldn't get it from the abstract of the paper, I think the fair thing to say is they quite emphatically favored psilocybin. Virtually every measure, I think it was over 95% of the measures, because there was only one that didn't separate significantly, statistically significantly, in favor of psilocybin, and that happened to be what we call the primary outcome, or the measure that we selected before the trial to be the one that we would make the main comparison on. And Sod's law, whatever you want to call it, the universe conspired to make that the only measure that psilocybin didn't, significantly win on. And so hence, the paper's reported in this way as there's no difference here, nothing to see here. And that's been an uncomfortable experience, because I think it's misleading to the reader and to the public. And I think people will get that if they look at the results. So I very much encourage people to actually read that paper, just read the abstract, look at the results, look at the supplementary material, and then, make a reasoned interpretation, what they think it means.
As someone who takes an SSRI, the advantage of something like psilocybin that immediately sticks out to me is the comparative lack of side effects. Can you talk a bit about that and why that is important?
Yeah. I guess, when you're taking a drug every day, you've got drug in the body and blood all the time, really. And so it's just the way it is that there's going to be some side effects there. And some of the classic ones with SSRIs are things like, actually drowsiness was higher in the escitalopram condition. What we call an emotional blunting, which is a kind of shallowing of the peaks and troughs of emotionality. We had higher rates of anxiety in the escitalopram condition, and sexual dysfunction as well was there. So there was quite a range, but I mean, if you look at the sheer number of side effects, it was actually quite equal in the two conditions. And the reason for that was that a big dose of psilocybin often gives you a headache the next day. And so it was all those headaches that counted to kind of create this balanced number of side effects. But the nature of the side effects were different. And those transient headaches are, they're transient. So you have them the next day, you might take an aspirin, and people would generally rate them as mild in severity.
So looking at how actually how that you think psilocybin actually works to kind of to be effective. So what I've read is that it kind of helps to, I think it might have been you that said it, but a really useful analogy that I found was that it kind of, I think it was a snow globe analogy, where it kind of shakes up a snow globe and lets things settle, and then from that you can kind of create new neural pathways that and it kind of breaks the kind of ruminative neural pathways in something called the default mode network. Is that something, have I misinterpreted that, or is that something that's true?
So generally speaking, that's the sort of mostly the model, I would say, kind of the hypothesis, albeit with bits of indirect data supporting it. And so it is a metaphor, that snow globe analogy that I came up with. So the idea is that when you fall into a mental illness, whether it's a depression, a eating disorder, a image disorder, like body dysmorphic disorder, or a addiction, or some obsessive symptoms, there's something common to these conditions, and it is that the mind gets rooted in a particular way, and that way is, you might call it maladaptive, and then it gets reinforced, and then the question becomes, a question is, well, why does that happen? Does it have a function? And increasingly, I think that's a really interesting question. It's kind of a different question to how does psychedelics work in this presentation, but it's an important one. And so just a couple of words on that. I think it probably happens as a sort of defensive, it's a defensive function, whatever the kind of underlying cause, let's call it a combination of vulnerability and maybe some genetic contribution to that, generally a kind of smudgy vulnerability, and then life. And whether that's a distinct trauma or complex trauma, or
one kind of key distinction that I've been reading about is the fact that you can't just give someone one of these substances without having the proper kind of support in place. So what in your trial, what support did you have around
Yeah, well,
before they took the, yeah, sorry,
that's
go on.
okay. We had some good support. We had a very good therapy team headed up by Rosalind Watts, a clinical psychologist, and so we had training for the therapy team, and some experienced old heads provided input into that training. Historically, we've been trained up by someone called Bill Richards, who was actually doing research with LSD in the late 60s before it was shut down. So, he was around in that initial wave of research and is now active and actually has a center in his name in Maryland in the US, the Bill Richards Center, doing treatment with psilocybin therapy now. But anyway, we had the therapy, and the therapy has three parts. It has the preparation ahead of the experience, which is all about building rapport and a sense of trust with the therapists, specifically the therapists who look after a patient will usually be two people. We like to go with the male and female, but that's just maybe a preference rather than a hard rule. It may be that different genders work for different people. But so we have those two, and you build trust beforehand as part of the prep ahead of the session. And then the session itself is supervised. The patient lies with eye shades on and listens to music throughout. There's minimal dialogue. Going into the experience, we might do some guided imagery and like a body scan where you describe, sensations in different parts of the body moving up through the body. So it's good to kind of center people and bring them into the here and now. And then the integration is what happens afterwards. And really, that's just an opportunity to talk through the experience. For the therapist, the main role is listening. And for the patient, it is that opportunity to share, to be heard, to reconnect, and also to try and consolidate and reinforce some of the healthy realizations that will have emerged both during the experience and in this aftermath period as well.
Yeah, so it's very much a kind of integrated process throughout the experience rather than
It
just
is. Yeah, and I think people don't know that. They could easily take a big dose of a psychedelic and then it just feel the insanity of it and not really get any benefits and just think, how is this an antidepressant intervention and more, because it's insane, it's wild. And that is part of the picture, but it's all about combining this potent, mind-shaking drug with a very caring, good quality of psychotherapy, and there lies the synergy.
yeah. And I think your work specifically focused on people with depression that was very hard to treat or hadn't previously worked with other forms of therapy. And I was wondering, earlier you were talking about the way that that ruminative conditions seem to react quite well to these drugs. So can you see any potential in using it to treat chronic pain? So not necessarily for people with, acute injuries or something like that, but where the kind of pathways become very set in feeling that certain actions bring about certain pain. So once you've moved beyond the kind of acute stage towards the chronic pain, because I can see very strong similarities between the kind of mindsets of chronic pain and depression and OCD and even something like an eating disorder.
Yeah, there are strong commonalities there around kind of reinforced way of thinking about things and maybe behaving if we're thinking of, say, an addiction or compulsive behaviors. And so, yeah, the idea is that the psychedelic can come in and shake things up. Yeah, that snow globe analogy. and that can sort of provide an opportunity for what you might call a de-weighting or a recalibration of the weighting of different ways of thinking and feeling and being, and acting, and so that recalibration analogy is quite a useful one. It's sort of saying, here is an opportunity for a relearning, a healthy relearning, and that relearning might involve a bit of unlearning of reinforced ways of thinking about things, and rather than like a new learning, like taking on new stuff, it's more like a recalibration or a reset. It's sort of like going back to the beginning, back to basics and starting afresh. So that's the analogy. And if it's chronic pain and you're living with this constant reminder, this constant thought of pain and of obviously sensation, really it's on the perception and the interpretation of the sensation that we believe we can make the greatest impact. So you might think of the therapeutic model as one of sort of learning how to live with the pain, the sensation, how you look on it and how you look on yourself, so rather than it be an analgesic, it's more like resetting the way that you're looking on the pain.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of bring us on to the last couple of questions, where do you see things like psychedelic assisted therapy in 10, 20 years time? Where do you think it's going as a method?
That's a good question. So, I mean, in 10 years' time, I think we'll have psychedelic clinics across America, I would say, particularly in the progressive states, and Canada. It will be big in Canada, particularly if the Liberals stay in. And in the UK and Europe, in 10 years' time, we'll have the same, I think. We'll have psychedelic clinics, and we will probably see that psilocybin therapy and MDMA therapy are licensed by the medicine regulators to be given to certain populations. There might even be change in the legislation on, say, magic mushrooms, where they're more in a kind of cannabis class than the ridiculous Schedule 1 Class A status that they carry at the moment, which is so at odds with their relative harms.
Yeah, sorry, can you go? Schedule 1 means that it's very hard to get research in them, and they kind of carry the same punishments as a Class A drug. Is that right?
Yeah, it is, and the formal definition is that this is a drug with significant abuse potential and no recognized medicinal value. And so I would say already the weight of the evidence is that psychedelics have medicinal value used in the right way. So that definition is just at odds with the scientific evidence already. And so it's just a matter of time. In a sense, it's a waiting game for the inevitable. That sounds very presumptuous, but unless there's some kind of sideswipe, kind of jackknifing incident, something that we haven't foreseen, I do feel that it's a logical progression that psychedelic medicine will become part of the armamentarium, is it? The toolkit clinicians within the next 10 years.
So the other aspect of the Schedule 1 that you were talking about is the potential for addiction. And from what I've read, psychedelic drugs carry a very low potential for addiction. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. So and the reason for it is that the effects aren't rewarding. Like, they don't make you feel good in a simple, basic kind of way. I think most people under the influence of a psychedelic, there's some degree of struggle and a requirement conscious requirement in a way to sort of let go, to surrender to the experience. But it's not something you can easily do in, I don't know, a social context or an everyday context. You really need to have a secure, settled environment. Very, very intense effects often.
And am I right in thinking that places like, I think is it Oregon or Portland? I can't remember which is the town and which is the state, but is it that they've legalized the therapy or they've legalized the drugs? I can't quite remember.
That's right. Yeah. So Tom and Cherie Eckert really led that initiative it's the state of Oregon, and they're based in Portland, and they were successful. They managed to do all the different stages to get psilocybin therapy on the ballot in the presidential elections in the state of Oregon. People voting could also vote on the legalization of psilocybin therapy, and they won. They got the majority of the people of Oregon voting to support this rollout of psilocybin therapy. Tragically, before the new year, Cherie died, and so it's a remarkable sort of story that she managed to do this, and out of the blue, tragically, a heart attack. We lost her, but at least she managed to see the success, remarkable success in getting this through. And the Oregon model is such a sort of epic tale, really, that they did get this through. And now over the next 2 years, so less now, is the planning towards the actual rollout of psilocybin therapy within the health authority system within Oregon. So it's a regulated system. It's still healthcare, although it's not constrained to people with a diagnosed psychiatric disorder, but it's regulated. So it's a very forward-thinking model. It's a model I like. I think it can work, and I think it could bring a lot of good in Oregon, and then other states being inspired and trying to go the same way.
Yeah, I think that's a positive place to leave the discussion about psychedelics. And one thing we always ask people is how you personally look after your own mental health.
Well, my kids are great teachers. They both bring stress, but also, a kind of down-to-earthness. And so I'm grateful to them and my wife, my family. I'm very lucky in that regard. And so if there's something I do, it's spending time with them. And then when they go to bed, if I can, meditation, mindfulness of breath, and meta meditation. Yeah.
That's cool. I just last year I got my qualification as a mindfulness instructor, because that was something that really helped me with pain and depression. And I think is there potential to kind of use that as I don't know if aftercare is the right word, but after you have your psilocybin session?
Very much so. Yeah, a bit of a plug. I'm developing an app called Mydelica that is all about providing educational material and pointers in the direction of things like meditation to try and I suppose keep people well, develop a kind of flexibility and healthy flexibility. So very much it's more sort of before and after rather than during. I would say that meditation has the greatest value when used in conjunction with psychedelics.
Yeah. And anything else? Where can we find more about the work you're doing at Imperial, other projects like you just mentioned?
I try and put everything on Twitter, any new papers. I'm moving to the States in mid-August to UCSF in San Francisco. But I'll be tweeting, and Mydelica as well. We're just building it right now, but we'll launch it later this year, so people could search Mydelica and find the landing page and subscribe for the app when it's ready.
So does that mean the Centre for, I can't remember the exact name, the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial, is that going to carry on, or is that...
It goes on, and I hope it goes on for a long time. It was founded by some very generous philanthropists, and their support continues, and the funds that were brought in continue to support a good few years of top quality research. David Nutt, you couldn't imagine a steadier pair of hands taking over. So he'll be the head of the centre, and then David Arizzo, my close colleague and friend, he's very much involved in the programme of research that will be run through the centre as well.
Brilliant. I think that's a positive place to leave it. Thank you so much, Robin. That's been really fascinating.
A pleasure.
Hi everyone. I really hope you enjoyed that episode. Just a quick note to say that although the things I discussed with the guest we may find helpful, I'm not a trained medical professional. If you're struggling with your mental health, please contact your GP or speak to an organisation like Samaritans on 116 123.